I'm sorry, everyone, that I couldn't be there in person.
No worries. Starting our recording and our broadcast. I have 7 o'clock, so I'm looking to our attendees list at the moment, and I'll keep an eye on that. With that, I will defer to the chair.
All right, thank you. I'm Ken Swanton. I'm actually the vice chair. We'll start by taking the roll. So just say either here or present. Mr. Shagnon,
Here, present.
Mr. Bennett,
I'm present.
Ms. Scow,
She is not here at present, and I do not see her in the audience as yet.
and she is expected.
She was expected, yes.
Yeah. And then Mr. Junta,
Present.
and I am here as well. So we have 4 people. We can begin. Customarily, since we have a request for a continuance, we usually do that first. So if no one objects, why don't we just, if we get a motion for continuance?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Just to clarify, it's 26 Beacon Ave has requested a continuance to May 14th.
Does somebody want to move that?
I'll move that the 26 Beacon Ave matter be.
Okay, is there a second?
I'll second Mr. Shagnon.
All right, so it's been moved and seconded. Is there anybody here to say anything about it? Or I guess not. I don't see anybody. So is there?
No, I don't. It does not look like it. No.
Is there any discussion? Seeing none, we'll just move to a vote. We'll just go around the table, basically. Mr. Shagnon,
Yes.
Mr. Bennett,
Yes.
Mr. Junta,
Yes.
and I vote yes. That's 4 votes in the affirmative. It is continued. So that gets us to our minor modification for 40 Parker Street, and there's someone there to present that. So we will open, actually, it's not a hearing. We'll just begin the discussion and hear what they have to say.
Sure. Mark, did you want to, or did you want to address the board?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for hearing our request for minor modification for our wind turbine installation.
I'm sorry, would you?
Yes, I'm sorry. I will, my name is Mark Ritchie. I'm owner and president of Mark Ritchie Woodworking at 40 Parker Street, and I'm here with Chris Carroll, CFO of Mark Ritchie Woodworking. So we requested a minor modification to our special permit, which was granted, I believe, in 2008. And we are only requesting a minor portion of the permit to be changed. We are have been doing a noise study every year. We haven't done every year, but most every year, and we have had no changes whatsoever to the noise or sound, I should say, levels emitted by the wind turbine in all the studies. And it is a very costly and time-consuming and complicated study to do, actually. We have to go at all different times of the day and night and set up monitors, and it has every time we've done the study, the noise has not changed at all. So we are asking to omit just that portion of our annual compliance, and we're hoping that you can do that for us.
And one thing to mention too is if a legitimate noise complaint arose, we would conduct the study at that time.
I would like to, thank you, Chris. I would like to add to that legitimate, because we do from time to time have neighbors that say, hey, there's noise over your wind turbine. Could you address that? And of course, we look into it immediately. But sometimes these are just false alarms. For example, one or two or more than that times, we've had complaints when the turbine hasn't been running for weeks and even months. So people don't always know, and, you know, I don't fault anyone. It's hard sometimes to tell where noise is coming from, but people don't always know. So we look, our first course of action always, when we receive any kind of complaint for our business, is to look into it. So, but of course, and we do that by not just stepping outside and listening to our turbine, but to going up onto the hill, across the street where some of the complaints have come to, because it's a, you know, direct, exposure to the turbine, to other parts of the neighborhood, and check on it ourselves to make sure that, hey, but usually, we could hear something unusual. And, so again, though, I would like to stress that every time we've done one of these noise studies, and they take many days to set up and quite a bit of work and analysis, and they're actually quite expensive. We have had no changes to the sound emitted from the turbine from the day it was installed. So.
Through the chair, this is Andy Ford. May I address the board briefly regarding the matter?
Yes,
Just briefly, Jennifer, our zoning administrator, is not here this evening, but we have discussed this particular matter. I also had a discussion with her and the building commissioner regarding this particular report that goes back a number of years. And is relatively older permit, at least for my tenure here. And I guess the sum result is we defer to the board, but from the office's perspective, there's not a whole lot of utility being gained at this point from receiving these reports. In part, or in large part, I would say mainly because from our perspective, it's a question of whether or not there are any issues, you know, that are going on there, complaints being received. We're not seeing any of that. So in essence, it's not clear to us that the cost and the time being spent on this particular report, well, it might have been, you know, warranted at the time of the permitting to address a concern and make sure that there wasn't going to be a problem. You know, as Mark mentioned, it doesn't seem to be providing any utility today as a report, given that there aren't any, you know, complaints that are coming in. So again, we defer to the board as to how you want to handle it. Here we're pointing back to that, in essence, because the office does not have the standard condition that's in our more recent permits that says if something is relatively minor, it might be modified, you know, by the staff if it's in a minor level. There's no language of that effect of any type in this permit, so it has to go back to the board. But from our office's perspective, it's not obvious that it provides any utility today, so we have no objection whatsoever to removing that component. Recognize, of course, at the time that there was you know, more discussion about the turbine. So with that, I defer back to the chair.
okay, thank you.
I would need for the record that Lynn came in as well, so she's here for the meeting as well. Yeah.
Hi, Lynn. Does the applicant have anything else they'd like to say before we get to our questions?
Sorry, actually, Gretchen, I think.
If I say something?
Yeah, that's fine. Gretchen actually wanted to say
So
something.
we have communicated, Mr. Ritchie and I have communicated by email because we're a neighbor. And, right around the time of COVID, we had never heard anything for years. We never heard a single sound from there. But we could start hearing the sound. And the response I always got was that there's many noises coming out of the industrial park, and so we can't tell that it's the turbine. But you can see, the first reason why I contacted him was because it sounded like something was wrong, because it was making it sounded like you would expect something to be out of balance. So I only contacted you because I thought, it sounds like something's not quite working here. And it did stop it was shut down after that and seemed to be repaired, but you can see when the blades are spinning and there's a rhythmic sound, you can visually make the connection, like there's other noises in the industrial park, and you can hear a consistent noise. But when there's a blade moving and your eyes and your ears are at the same rhythm, you know where it's coming from, the blades. And so that rhythmic sound has passed, but we can hear a sound now that we never used to hear.
I'm sorry, could you clarify since about, you're saying more recently?
You know, yes. So this sound that we heard that was like the rhythmic sound that went on, I would say that was maybe 2019, I'm not sure. It was in the fall, I think, and then it was, I believe, it was shut down for a period of time, and there seemed to be some work on it, and then when it did start up again, we can hear in our house, like, there's noise in there. And in the winter, we can hear it in the house at night when, you know, all the windows are closed. So to me, I do perceive a change.
Thank you.
Because we went all those years from when it was installed until that time, where we never complained about it. I never thought of contacting the planning office.
Oh, no, thank you for, no, I mean, yeah, for bringing it up.
But I never thought about it until, and, you know, I had good intentions when I contacted you by saying, I would just be out in the yard and I'd hear this noise, I'd say, something is wrong with that, it's not working. Because it had never made that kind of noise before.
So is your sense that it's a higher decibel level or that it's more noticeable than before, or is
It's
it?
not a high, well, I wouldn't say it's a high decibel now, just more like a hum. Now, I can't say that I've noticed it recently.
Okay. It's like a background hum at this point,
Yes.
okay, got it.
Yes, actually, I haven't thought about it at all for a while, because it did become like a kind of steady background noise in our house. But I haven't, in all honesty, for a while now, I haven't paid attention. So I
Okay.
just want on record as saying that.
The next stage is for the board to ask questions, but was there anything else that the applicant would like to say before we ask our questions? Seeing none, who would like to begin? Which of our board members would like to begin with questions?
I'll ask a few if that's all right with you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple questions. When was the last time that you performed the required sound measurement test?
2021.
And did the results of that test indicate that the noise met the city noise ordinance?
Yes,
Decibel level?
yes.
Could you tell me, if you can remember, of the levels that were measured and what the town, city level requirement is, if you can?
Well, we have that report and
Okay.
it was submitted to you and we have it right here in front of us.
Yeah, can you just tell us what the decibel level, the measured decibel level was?
Sure. So the measured decibel level at 3 miles per hour was 41 dBA, 43 dBA at 6 miles, and 45 dBA at 9 miles per hour.
Okay,
With typical sound, this is the interesting part, with typical ambient sound levels, meaning highway
I understand.
of 50 to 55.
Understood. Can you tell me what the city noise ordinance level is? While you're looking, I'll ask Andrew. Do you know that, Andrew?
Well, actually, you're just putting up on the screen here a section from the code.
Yeah. So if I don't know if I'm the best person, I'm not the best person to interpret that. But let me ask another question then. Does the report conclusion, which is signed by an independent engineer, certify that the noise measured at the facility was in compliance with city requirements?
Yes, it does.
It does say that.
It does say that.
Okay. And I take it that the test was conducted under varying operational levels.
Yes.
Could you expand on that a bit?
Sure. So it was taken at a variety of different times, including the typically quietest times of the day during the night when the ambient traffic noises would be at their lowest. During and always when it was operating, because the wind turbine, it's not like you turn it on or off, it has to have wind. So, and from different wind directions and, also during times of, significant ambient noise or middle of the day, I suppose, but at a variety of different times and, over a period of, several weeks. So not just a single reporting. And it's taken at the, perimeters of our, property.
Are the noises recorded representative of your normal operations at the facility?
Yes.
How many, aside from this most recent one, 2021, how many tests overall have you done since 08? If you have,
We did five consecutive tests from 08 through 2014.
okay. Now, with respect to those 5 tests, did any of those tests indicate that there was a violation of city
None.
ordinance requirements?
They were virtually identical. I mean, minor differences, but, they were all, well within the city's ordinance.
Okay. What does this test cost today?
This test, including the report and the analysis, is about $6,000 or $7,000.
I don't remember exactly.
That order of magnitude?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Have you ever received a formal notice of violation from the city regarding noise from the facility?
No.
Have you ever received a written, notice of or a written complaint from any person regarding noise?
Emails from neighbors,
And,
but they were just inquiring about the noise.
I understand.
Yeah, say they were in any way scientific or.
I understand, I understand. When was the last time you received a comment from the neighbors regarding noise? You can recall.
I
Sure,
don't have it.
yeah,
Okay,
I can't recall any time.
not recently.
not within the last year or so.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sure.
That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Bennett. Who would like to go next?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Sorry, apologize for coming late, and if you already covered this, but in the letters, I think, to the planning department and to, Mr. Earls, mentioned that if you received a legitimate complaint about the noise or question about it, that you would have the study done at that time,
Yes.
which to me seemed very reasonable. But I guess beg the question, what would a legitimate complaint be?
Right, that's a good question.
Yeah.
And
Is there a certain-
we would, I think, first do what we always do is go and try to assess it, because,
Mhm.
you know, we're interested in that as well. I mean, if it's making excessive noise, it's a potential that there's, something wrong with it, so we want to address that. And we do very regular and significant maintenance to keep the wind turbine going, so we're aware of all its mechanical, operation at all times. So we would look into it, and if we could ascertain that, yeah, that there's definitely something different sounding, then we would, first order of action would be to stop it. And then, but then to measure it as well. I mean, if we could find no real mechanical problems with it, and I can't address exactly, what you were referring to as the noise, but I appreciate what you're saying. I will say, though, that, depending on wind direction and wind speed, and some other factors, the wind turbine in certain directions will have, lesser or greater sound. And, that's why so you may be looking at the wind turbine one day and it could be totally silent. And then another day, just because the wind is blowing away from you, or I should say blowing at you, could be bringing the sound through the wind. So that's why we have tested it at a variety of different days, different wind speeds and different wind directions. And I mean, I'm not saying that the wind turbine doesn't make any noise. It does. But the noise it makes is within the city's ordinance. And what we were permitted for.
That was my question, thank you.
Okay.
How about Mr. Shagnon or Mr. Junto? Do you have any questions?
Yeah, I'll go next. I noticed in the reports, they concentrated on 3 different wind speeds, like 369, I think.
Mhm.
Yet the unit can run all the way up to 15. So there's quite a large band of operating speeds, 10 to 15. Where they admit it makes more noise, but I didn't see it documented.
So,
And I know the wind regime probably, it doesn't run up there that often. 15 miles an hour is pretty steady wind, fast. But somewhere in that 10 or 15, I assume it's making the most aerodynamic noise it can.
I think you're right, but I also believe, and I believe talking with Doug on this, that when you get to those higher speeds, the ambient noise is so high that there's no
It's not
discernible.
significant to see it above it.
That's right. The ambient sound at over 15 miles per hour becomes so high that the sound of the wind machine is no longer creating decibels that are detectable above that.
The other
But they
question,
have measured it in those speeds.
yeah. The other thing was, I couldn't tell from any of the studies which direction it had yawed, like if it was facing north or south or east or west. Because I think wind turbines put out the majority of their aerodynamic noise downstream.
That's right.
As the blade passes, the noise is behind.
Well, the wind is carrying the sound.
Sound with it. Which would be great if it was towards Route 1 all the time.
Yeah,
But there must be a time when it flips around, when I guess the wind would be out of the northeast, where the tail of the unit would be facing back into the industrial park.
that's right.
And you might get more noise. But I didn't see anything in there that commented on directional, because when, if you're standing in front of a wind turbine, you may not hear it at all. Birds fly into it, right? They don't hear it at all. But the back is where the majority of the noise is. It still seems fairly small. The biggest noise was 75 dB. My voice is probably 65. So it's still pretty mild.
It is, I mean, there are other noises coming from the industrial park that I think sometimes people are not aware of.
Right.
Where they're coming from. And,
Yeah.
Again, I don't want to pretend that the wind turbine doesn't make noise. It does. But,
I guess the good thing is there doesn't seem to be any pattern or record of people walking to your door saying the thing is screeching and making a racket. That's a positive sign. I have no other questions.
Mr. Junto, do you have any questions?
Sure, I have a few. So what's the lifespan of the windmill?
that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So this particular machine is, it's designed for a 25-year lifespan. I personally don't think it will make it that far. I wish it would, but we don't think it will. And I believe for that reason, the special permit was 25 years or maybe 28 years. It may be a little longer than that. It was sort of when we created the ordinance in the city, it was, they looked at that. They said, well, what's the lifespan of this? So, so I could talk a lot more about this subject because the question begs what to do when it's, no longer repairable. Yeah.
Well, it appears you're about 15, 16 years in.
That's right. It's about 15 years. Yeah.
Okay. Now, you have mentioned that you had studies from 2008 to 2014. Is there a gap of years before the 2021 study? Or has there been studies done every year?
So I'm not sure if that's if there wasn't another study in there, but we did another study in 21. We did have a number of years where the turbine was either not operating or barely operating. We had some major mechanical issues that we had to repair. We had to put a new generator in and some major work to the hub. And the turbine, this particular make and model, is no longer supported anywhere in the world. We're the last standing operating TurboWind 600 in North America. So when when a major part wears out, we have to figure out how to repair it ourselves. Sometimes it means actually building that part, but I mean, the major parts are available, like generator and gearbox, et cetera, but you know, all the complicated circuit boards, for example, some of the control equipment is difficult or impossible to find. So we've had more downtime than we would like with this turbine.
2019 and 2020 that it was non-operational.
Right.
Okay. And then the other question is from the ordinance that was up there, it said that you would be providing operating data, energy production, and operating days. Has that information yearly been given to the city? Is that public?
Yes,
For people to see that, and do we have every year that?
we do.
So there was a period of time from really this letter,
Yeah.
back in 2014, where it was not being reported to the city. However, in the package that was submitted for this meeting, all of that data was provided.
Okay, all right, and then I guess the last question I have is, I know from living in Newburyport, that the windmill was controversial at the time, and my question is, was that language put in for the buy-in of the neighbors to these certain things?
I can't answer that, to be honest with you, but I think that language was put in because they were modeling the ordinance after other ordinances this city had studied. This was the first wind turbine to be permitted in Newburyport, and
Sure.
one of the first in the whole region. So we were the first on the North Shore of Boston to install a large scale wind turbine. So there was a lot of learning from all sides going on. But
Okay.
I think that was typical to some of the other permits that they had studied at the time.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And just so you know where I'm coming from, I walk the rail trail all the time. I see a wind turbine all the time. I just get worried if things are put in place for the protection of the neighbors, or I don't want to take those away from the neighbors. If that's something they felt like they got as compromise, if you know what I'm saying, for this to be built, but I don't hear your turbine, it's never affected my life, I've walked past it a million times. I'm just worried that we forget about what we did in 2008. And then something happens and people say, oh, well, we have things in place, and then they find out that this board took those things out of place. I'm just a little concerned about that, maybe it's the former city councilor in me. But that's the only thing that right now is, but I don't have any issue with your turbine at all. So it's my own.
Okay, thank you. I just have one question. It's kind of a follow-up to Ms. Scow's question. This question of who decides if a complaint is legitimate. And I can imagine a situation where a neighbor sends a letter to you and to the city and says, hey, we think we have a legitimate complaint. Who decides? Do you decide? Does the city decide? Who decides what's a legitimate complaint?
Sorry, Ken, I defer to you as chair, but do you mind if I speak to that briefly?
Sure, please.
Sure, I defer to the board, and obviously, Mark, if you want to speak to as the applicant here, but just from the office's perspective, and just to clarify, and actually in response to Lynn's comment, their question, my sense would be, of an abundance of caution, let's say, if this is approved, my suggestion would be to make the condition of the language include that if the zoning administrator determines that there's a verified complaint, that this report would be done rather than leaving it to the discretion, so to speak, of the applicant or the property owner and so forth. That would provide a little bit more of a measure of, third party, sort of evaluation of that question, I guess. But again, I'll refer to the board and the applicant, or something
I
like
guess
that.
on the flip side, it also would provide some protection to the applicant, right? If you
Agreed.
have, I mean, you don't want to be in a position of having to do more than annual studies because we have a neighbor that keeps complaining.
Agreed.
I think
Yeah,
it's something that is, an arbitrable standard in some sort of way protects all parties.
I mean, it's the city's obligation to enforce the ordinance, it's not individuals.
I-
The city has all the tools to do that, and they do, I'm sure, so.
That-
I agree that's a creative suggestion from Andy Port. Is the applicant comfortable with that language?
Yes, that seems fair to me. I mean, that takes, as Ken said, it's it's the city's job to enforce that. It's like any other noise if there was somebody complaining that, hey, this person is making too much noise, I would think the city would come down and investigate and see, well, yeah, that is a lot of noise, or geez, that doesn't really seem like it warrants a full in-depth sound study. Because again, I just want to, these noise studies, surveys are very, you don't just come down with a meter and measure it. It has to be done at many different times, at all different times of the day, to get an accurate study. And then it goes through a fairly, in-depth process of evaluation of that information to produce a report that is useful to us. So I think that's a fair suggestion, and we would be comfortable with that, to answer the question.
Mr. Chair, could I just ask a couple more
Yes.
questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah. Could you put the picture of the windmill in the north neighborhood? So I see as I'm looking at this photograph, I'm seeing the windmill in the upper left.
Mhm.
So the nearest residence would be across the road to the right, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. How far is the wind turbine from your right-hand boundary as I'm looking at this photograph? Roughly, do you have an idea?
Well, that's a good question. So if you look at the building there, it's 200 feet wide, so
Okay.
I'd say it's about 500 feet from the property line there,
Yeah,
guessing.
gotcha. And where is the nearest resident?
I think as I recall, it's roughly 800 or 900 feet away, directly across the street of Route 1. But honestly, I
When you
think
say 800 or 900 feet from the turbine or from your property line?
would be from the turbine.
From the
I
turbine.
think so, because if that's 500 feet, the width of the property, so the building's about 1,000 feet long, at 500 feet wide. I'm just guessing now, looking at that, but I also do believe from the original application that the closest resident was roughly 800 feet away.
Okay.
But Ken, I think it's actually the residents that are higher up on the hill that probably are getting the most, sound or, from it, because they're more directly across from the turbine
Yeah.
itself.
Thank you for explaining. I appreciate your candor.
So how far is that?
so I just, for clarity, I just tried to throw up from our mapping software, just,
Okay.
about 645 feet to the condos that were recently
yeah.
built off Route 1.
Right, those weren't there when we built the winter.
Right, they were built more
Okay.
recently, but that's the closest resident
Yeah.
is, and that's
Okay.
about 645 feet.
Thank you.
Sure.
That's all I have. Thank you for those clarifications.
Okay, if there's no other questions from the board members, we're to the point where we should be deliberating on whether or not this is minor. If it's not minor, then basically we have to notice the abutters and do a hearing. So so I don't know who'd like to begin, but we need to decide whether this is a minor modification.
Well, I will move that the request to eliminate the annual sound study be treated as a minor modification.
Okay, and I assume you mean with the proviso that if there's a complaint, the planning department decides whether it's legitimate and a sound study would then occur, right?
Yeah, I thought, yeah, we can do that
Okay.
now, in one fell swoop, that would be good.
Okay, sorry, so that minor, and approve the request with the condition that the office of the zoning administrator determines if there's an instance that requires a report.
Yes,
How do other people feel about that?
Yes, I'm happy to go next. I would agree. I would think that this is a minor modification with the condition that if there's a complaint, that's a legitimate complaint as identified by the zoning administrator, that a sound study be done. In that respect, I don't think the neighbors are losing anything in the process, because if there's they can have the study done if there's a reason to have the study done.
Okay, anybody else? Bud or
I agree, I agree. Yeah, that was Bud.
yeah, I hear you. And Mr. Junta.
I have to say, I'm a little split on it, only because, sort of one of those original conditions to erect the turbine, and, I'm a little split on it. I'm not sure the neighbors know we're here having this conversation, and I don't know how they would feel about it. I may be a minority opinion on that, but it is my opinion.
Yeah, I in my own opinion, I kind of agree with the first three of you who spoke that this seems like a good solution. But I also agree with what I just heard that, it seems, I mean, the real question is, should we go through the process of advertising it and sending out a notice and letting people know we're doing this? It seems reasonable to me to do it, but if this was something to do with setbacks or massing or something that we do all the time that we're very comfortable with, that would be one thing. But this is the first wind turbine I've seen in over 4 years on the board, and I'm just not that comfortable. So I realize it's a pain to have to advertise and set out letters, and I'm not sure it'll change anything because I think we have a good solution here, but I'd kind of like, I feel it would be better to let the abutters, at least give them a chance to chime in. And I'm basically kind of agreeing with what I just heard. So, Andy, what does it take? I forget with a minor modification. Is it a majority vote or is it 5 out of 4?
We've typically treated that as a simple majority vote, of the board.
Okay. Well,
Because it's not the initial, permitting of the use in question, it's just a detail of the permit, so.
can I just comment on Larry, on your concerns, which are, legitimate. I would just say this, that conditions that were imposed in 08, to me now, at least that condition regarding the implementation of an annual test seems to have served its purpose. And in my view, to continue with that for the only reason that it was there in 08, and we're now in 2024, seems to me not to be faithful to what we ought to be doing, that is protecting being concerned about the obviously stated concerns, of which there have not been any. We have 5 years of tests, we have no violations. Based upon these reports, we have no objections, violations noted by the city. And it's not unusual, at least in my experience, to see conditions have an expiration date. I know there aren't in this, but I think it would be, I think we would be honoring our obligations to the neighbors as well as our obligations to the applicant here. But I take your points. I mean,
Appreciate that.
If I could just ask another question, Andy, did you say that in more recent applications that the staff is given discretion to take out some of these conditions? And
Yeah, sorry, just to clarify,
It's
so, yeah, in more recent decisions, this is, been a number of years now, but for both the planning board and the zoning board of appeals, because there are oftentimes these very minor things that are being tweaked, like literally like, 6 inches of some, minor thing that has nothing to do with the setback in the lot line, but some minor tweak of a window on a facade or some, minor detail like that. So, in essence, the board has decided that it's not worth the trouble overall to bother the board and bother the applicant coming in for something like that. So we put some boilerplate language in the decision that allows the staff to review something if it's deemed minor. We talk about that internally, the zoning administrator and I, and if we have any reason to believe that there's something that's substantive to the original approval or it's going to be considered, major in any way, we send the applicant back to the board. We actually are on the side of caution there and send, more back than, just to be sure. But at the end of the day, there have been, miscellaneous minor things that are changing. We never approve anything of that nature if we think it's in any way substantive to the board's original approval. We always send the applicant back. In this case, this is like a lot of the older decisions that had no provision like that whatsoever. And so, you can imagine with the number of permits out there going on, if somebody needs to modify something very minor, but has to come in and wait for, several weeks to the board, coming in, a lot of process just to do some minor tweak like that. That was the way the board wanted to balance both boards. It's like you wanted to balance between sort of, as I described, sort of wasting everybody's time with going through this extra process to do something that's relatively minor in nature. This is something, as you can see here, to Larry just point. Well, the office doesn't have any objection for the removal of this component here and modifying it as we talked about. It's understandable in context that the board should probably make that decision here in the context of the original approval rather than the staff. And so, for instance, on the whole spectrum, even with that language, we might have considered this to be, something that should go back to the board. So that helps it all to clarify.
Okay, does anybody else have any comments or things? I would add one comment, which I found Greg Bannick's comments to be compelling, that about how we got here. It's been a long time and there have been no complaints, and we have a system where if people do complain, it'll be looked into. So I guess I can be more comfortable. Anyway, would somebody like to make a motion?
You make the same motion?
I will make the same motion.
With the condition.
With the condition, I move that we treat the requirement to perform annual sound and noise tests at the facility to be removed from the application, be treated as a minor modification with the condition that the obligation will be imposed if the zoning officer determines that there has been a violation of the city's noise ordinance.
Is there a second?
I'll second that, Mr. Shagnon.
All right, we have a motion. It's been seconded. On a minor modification, are we supposed to confer again, or do we just vote? Andy, what do we do?
We should vote, and I would just note, a vote doesn't happen all the time. When you have remote members, it should be roll call, just for the record.
All right, we'll roll call. So Mr. Shagnon,
Yes.
Mr. Bennett,
Yes.
Ms. Scow,
yes,
Mr. Junta?
No.
I'll vote yes. So that's 4 in the affirmative. The motion passes. And I guess thank you very much.
The office will return to you. There'll be a certificate of vote that will reflect what was discussed here tonight and the board's vote. So you'll have that sort of circle back to you by Caitlin or Jennifer shortly. We'll circle back to that.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was an interesting one. That concludes our business. I think we have minutes to approve. If somebody would like to move the approval of the minutes or any discussion of the minutes.
I'll move approval of the minutes
326.
of March 26th. Thank you.
Put it up there. I'll second the motion to approve the minutes as submitted.
Okay, I guess since I'm remote, we'll go around the room again. Mr. Shagnon,
Yes.
Mr. Bennett,
Yes.
Ms. Scow,
Yes.
Mr. Junta,
Yes.
and I vote yes, so that one's unanimous. So now we have updates from the chair or I have none, or the planning director. Do you have any updates, Andy?
No, just two things real brief. One is that we are expecting still at this point, Karis North from Murphy, Hesse, Toomey and Lehane, our legal counsel, to be attending the meeting on the 23rd. We'll touch base if there's any reason for that to change. We had talked previously about having her come in to talk about short-term rental units, the criteria for review, prior to getting an application. We're expecting that application or two maybe to be sometime in, going to May, maybe at this point, so we'll see. That's just an FYI that's, we're expecting the next meeting to have a discussion with her probably at the end of the meeting, I assume. The other thing I just wanted to know was, although it's not, this board hasn't typically taken the role of providing advice for zoning changes per se. I just wanted to throw it out there that given we're having discussions right now about the whole MBTA communities requirements, if you've been tracking that at all, and where we do the zoning that actually applies with the state versus other zoning that might be done. I realize I'm not giving you the whole presentation of all the different facets and pieces to consider and all that, but if you have any particular thoughts on that or questions or, or concerns, feel free to relay those to me so we can take those into account as we're doing whatever the outcome is there. We're currently discussing with the city council and a working group, including planning board members, about, how to resolve that. And we've thrown out various different maps as alternatives, in different areas, but largely we're talking about expanding the 40-hour district, which is right around the train station here. So if you have any questions or thoughts about that, let me know. I'm happy to,
Are you gonna do it by an overlay, or are you just gonna expand the existing
The
district?
current district is an overlay, so I would assume here that the expansion will also be an overlay.
Okay.
And so, while it doesn't mean that we couldn't necessarily alter the underlying zoning, for instance, here, what has primarily been discussed of late is expanding down Parker Street, some of this section of Parker Street, which that incidentally is across the street from or near, the Mark Ritchie facility. But going a little further than, because you already have 1 and 3 Boston Way that were recently constructed right across from Mark Ritchie's incidentally. So there's been discussion there about expanding the 40-hour district. There's a whole spectrum of criteria. And we have to take into account in making the decision, and some of it comes down to where we get credit, where we don't, what parameters the state, there's a whole bunch of layers of parameters we have to follow in order to have a compliant district, so to speak. So I realize I'm not summarizing all of that, but in large part, their focus has been, we did talk about using Story Avenue and Low Street, but that has been largely abandoned for strictly working off of the existing 40-hour district. The one caveat that I would give to that is an expansion. Sorry, I should maybe just for graphical reference. I did actually have some map of our 40-hour district, but sorry, just to make it a little easier for you to orient yourselves.
It doesn't, are we the special permit granting authority or is it the planning board?
No, you were not. And it's actually technically not a special permit. It's as of right permitting with design review, so it's considered a plan approval. Not even technically the same term as a site plan approval, but basically similar. So in essence, it's the planning board, and that's why I say it's you don't have the statutory authority to, or you need to give advice to the city council procedurally. But if you have any thoughts on this, obviously the more feedback we have, the better. But there's been discussion recently of expanding the 40-hour district to go this way, essentially to grab what's the Heinz Way development. You don't see in this map that I produced a couple of years ago. And it's right in this location here. That only makes up a couple of units really, but building up to make more units than the existing 40-hour district, which is like 3/4, I should say, of what we need to comply with the state. We already are ahead with this 40-hour district. To do that, there's been discussion of going down Parker Street in this section here as being a potential place to do that. The other location that's been discussed more recently is going up Route 1 to Empro. That has some other questions, implications, because we'd be looking at essentially where the Timberline wood facility is. And it's sort of like between the next to the rail trail, essentially that section of Low Street that goes right underneath the rail trail. Whether or not we make a district that's contiguous between Empro crossing underneath Route 1 and over the rail trail going there. My inclination is to look at this Parker Street section here, myself on the whole spectrum, but that's because you have to understand like the different facets and keep in mind, but that's where the discussion has gone to date. So if you have any particular thoughts, it could be something else from beyond this. A lot of ideas have been thrown out, but in essence, there's certain parameters you have to follow, and that's where the conversation is tracked to date, is expanding off the 40-hour district. And there are various reasons for doing that, that keep greater control of the city. So yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So how much of this land will we lose control of as the city?
It's a great question. So, when we say lose control, in essence, we lose more control if we do a new district. And that's one reason, for instance, why I'm hesitant to do like a standalone district up by the Empro Low Street area. The reason for that is because with the 40R district, the state is giving us the permission to expand our boundaries of the district and use the same parameters, including the affordable housing percentage we've gotten, which is pretty a substantial bonus in the last couple of years that we've gotten.
And stay in control.
And we stay in better control of our local zoning. And I would generally, although I completely understand why the state's doing this, and I support, understandably why they want to have housing, why they want to have air transit. I am more inclined to keep Newburyport having as much control in some of the more sensitive areas of the city. So, and this is not to say that it means put it somewhere else, but rather I actually do think this would be a good beneficial place to have housing, because I think going forward, people will be looking for more housing in close proximity or more places of employment. So to me, this is actually going to be bolstering our business park and then the transit station to combine, but also in putting housing where we need it, but also keeping it in the 25% affordability threshold that we want, so to speak, as opposed to defaulting back to what the state is now doing, which is basically 10% or possibly up to 20, but not any higher than that. So if we were to do that, a district somewhere else, like Story Avenue, Low Street, or over at the Empro site or some other location, totally separate, not built out of this, not contiguous or connected, which is the other district now that's being discussed, that would have to be reverting back to the MBTA lower threshold and would not allow us to mandate as much affordable housing as we have with that. There's other parameters, of course, I'm not covering on both ends of the spectrum, but that's one. When you say more control, I guess I would argue that doing an expansion of the 40R district down by the train station is probably better for keeping control. One thing I have generally assumed is that, we're not talking, although there's 3 areas of the city that the state would consider eligible for this program, the downtown, the train station, and Story Avenue, Low Street area. I have generally assumed, and nobody else has disputed this, that, downtown, Waterfront West, things like that are very different beasts, so to speak, and there might be more discussion about an area like that, given its location in a historic area and all that. So we've seen discussions before about Waterfront West where new housing would happen anyway. So that being the case, we've only looked at the 2 other areas.
Are we as a city gonna slow walk this until we see if Milton wins their case against the state, which then would change everything?
Sure. I can appreciate that there's, I don't necessarily think that we have to. I actually think, like I said, we're like 900 units out of our existing 40R district, just from the way that it's calculated here is a little bit different than the original statutory program we did under. So in essence, we get like 3/4 of the balance there already just from our existing 40R district, but doing a bunch of, paperwork to fill it out. But at the end of the day, doing the expansion to me of like 300 units isn't necessarily a bad thing either, and isn't so hard to accomplish or problematic for the city in terms of land use patterns, in my view, that it warrants going that direction. However, there may be a few other communities that are either having difficulty or contemplating, pushback.
Yeah, I just would hate to see the city council make a decision that has ramifications and then find out, oh, we should have waited.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think that, I can't recommend that route. I also don't necessarily, I do think the state will pursue it to some degree. I don't know whether or not there'll be any spectrum of, of things like that, but to me, it's not necessarily the path that we need to do, I guess, is the way I look at it.
Does the 40R housing with the 25% affordable housing, that's a higher requirement than the MBTA community, which you said is 10 to 20%? Is the 25% a requirement of 40R?
Yeah, it's a little bit counterintuitive in my view, the MBTA piece coming, more recently than the 40R piece here, mainly because in 40R, under that program, you had to have at least 20% to make an eligible district. At least 20% of the units had to be affordable. You could choose to go up to 25. We did that consciously for a good reason. Primarily, you're creating 5 more units out of every 100 units of the project. You're creating 5 more units that are actually affordable. But we also were very cognizant that, and this is another idiosyncrasy in the different statutes that kind of overlap here, but in 40B, you have to keep in mind all these different statutes and what's going on in these pieces. But in essence, under 40B, if you have a rental project that's proposed and 25% of those units are affordable, the subsidized housing inventory that's used to determine whether or not we can have a safe harbor from unwanted or inappropriate 40B projects that might be too dense for a given area elsewhere in the city that we might be concerned about more so. In this case, the 40B requires you to have, if you have 25% units that are affordable and it's a rental, you get all 100 of the units or 100% of the units counted on the SHI, the subsidized housing inventory. So we're getting credit for the Minko projects that are rentals. We're getting credit for all the units in the building, even though only 25% of them are actually technically meeting the affordability threshold. That's because the state was also recognizing the importance of creating rental housing as a specific subset of those, housing that's needed by a segment of the population. So they're getting more credit for rentals essentially than for sale units. And in essence, that's where the biggest bang is that we've gotten for our buck in terms of protection of local zoning, so to speak, and being able to control what happened earlier in the city, maybe more so. The other piece, of course, being the other 5 units that would come out of a unit project would be affordable at that threshold.
So is it possible to expand this 40R district just by putting buffers around it that are MBTA without making it? I mean, I guess I'm saying, what, do we need to have the 25% threshold in the additional units that we're adding on to this area?
We don't need to have that threshold. We can go lower. We can go down to the 10% that of the sort of floor of the MBTA side of it. But most of the discussion that we've had today has erred on the side of we'd rather keep wherever we can the 25%. And the question being, if we're going to reduce that threshold, do we want to do it? And if so, where?
And is that just a policy reason that people are in favor of affordable housing, or is that getting us something like you're saying in other areas of the city?
I think 2 things. I think it's both of those factors. I think for Newburyport, depending, we have a lot of historic areas, sensitive, neighborhoods, in terms of character. So to me, it's actually both facets, and it depends on your perspective, what should be achieved here. Some people are more interested in satisfying the state without necessarily creating a substantial number of new units. Some people want to create new housing. Some people are focused on how do we get the affordable units out of, it. So I guess it depends on what you're trying to achieve, but here, I think we get bigger bang for our buck if we do a 25% threshold. So because we're creating more affordable housing, we're not just creating housing, but we're creating more affordable units. If you consider that those numbers that the state uses affordable, those are affordable. Then you also get this, better protection under safe harbor status, which is another state statute, just to be mindful of from a land use perspective, because whenever you're not in a safe harbor status, is a potential for a developer to come in and say, I don't like your local zoning, it's not dense enough for me, I want to do this, and I'm going to basically toss your zoning out the window. And as long as I do 25% of the units in my project that are affordable, which is back up to our 40R threshold, they can basically override any of your design constraints and things like that, which may not be beneficial or desirable. So the more recent Waterfront West came up, and there also was more recently proposed off of Dexter Lane. There was a concept proposed by a developer of a 40B in that location, which they seem to have sort of walked away from that idea. But 16 units on a lot that right now they're talking about maybe doing 4.
Is there any sort of correlation between affordable housing units and kids in the school district? I'm just curious about the impact on the school district.
I don't have the data behind that. And again, there's also a million different sources of that data, so it's hard for me to say which I would feel comfortable relying upon. There are a bunch of different sources of data for that. However, with the 40R district, there's a provision in there that, MBTA, in essence, the 40R district has one limited provision in it that actually requires a developer to, I forget the exact number, but the ratio, but they were trying to make sure that there was a sufficient ratio of 3-bedroom units, I can pull the provision, but a sufficient ratio of 3-bedroom units in the affordable section, not, having a developer come in and say, well, I'm only going to do 1 and 2 bedrooms for the affordables, right? So they were kind of making sure that the developer wouldn't skimp on 3-bedroom units in the affordable units. However, the main point maybe is that under MBTA communities, the state does not want or will not permit restrictions relative to the types of units or the number of bedrooms that are going on in those units, or age restrictions, things like that. They don't want to have these other limitations on the housing units. They just want to be multifamily available to anybody, so to speak. So they don't want to have restrictions of that nature that might then give a better prediction of how many bedrooms we can have, how many units, children is that going to produce.
There's no data on the number of affordable housing units and the impact on the school system.
I would say it's harder to predict under MBTA because there's no constraint that we can set by local zoning to determine what the ratios might be of 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, or studios. So it's,
And the MBTA community is just public transit money. It has no, they're not gonna give any money to help towns with school districts, for example.
yeah, the MBTA communities is very different than 40R. And the way I can best describe it is like 40R is almost like the carrot approach. Years ago, they said, you know, we'll give you financial incentives if you do zoning, and we decided for various reasons to do that. We got $2 million for the sewer lift station that's down on Graff Road now. So that was more of a carrot approach. This is basically the stick approach, with a simplified but differently constructed, you know, with different parameters, and some of them being, you know, maybe more or less better, good or better, worse. But it's the same sort of thing, put housing near transit, you know, denser multifamily as of right. But we're requiring you to do it, as opposed to saying, we're gonna give you grant incentives. The state, I'm sure, will parallel with some grant incentives with this stuff, but it's not the same strong correlation to an incentive. It's more of a mandate that you do it regardless of these
Right.
other things. So, yeah.
But expanding the 40R community, do you get the incentive?
We get the
as well?
incentive payments when, if somebody were to develop in the 40R and expanded, we get incentive payments when they do. We don't get those incentive payments if it's outside the 40R. So again, just another factor, another reason to me why we might want to expand the 40R overall is pros and cons across the spectrum, and I, you know, acknowledge that.
Okay.
But to me, I keep coming back to, with all this, I keep now more and more thinking that Parker Street is the right place to do some of this rather than some of these other locations. We've talked about the spectrum, there's certainly pros and cons to each of them, but to me, I definitely support the idea of expanding the 40R generically. And I'm disappointed that the state has set this cap at 20%, that they were not allowing us under MBTA to do the 25%, because that's how we would look different. It's not clear to me what the rationale is for that. If affordable housing is important, it's not clear to me why there's an arbitrary cap of 20.
They don't wanna pay the incentives. I mean, it's that simple, right? It's always about the money.
Yeah. If
Interesting.
this area starts to get built out, you and I had a private conversation about this. Are we able to tell, a builder, commercial on the first floor, build your condos, your rentals above, but don't destroy our commercial district and turn it into a residential district? It's
Yeah.
supposed to be a village, and
Yeah.
you need stores to be a village.
That's a great question. Yeah, actually, in our zoning district, what we did was we mandated that the developers basically working with us to make sure the first floor would make it viable for those uses going forward. 103 Boston Way, it was acknowledged they may not be able to have enough gravity of residents there to support our uses right off the bat. So we said, show us you designed the first floor to be, you know, as much opening as possible and as ceiling heights available. And then, you know, we understand that it might be live work units starting off, and maybe down the road, we'd have a little more of that, you know, true commercial use. So Haley site will actually have a true, you know, commercial use in there as well, or we're expecting maybe an ice cream type shop like the Haley's thing there, but at any rate, the MBTA communities, in order to do that, you under the 40R, we can press for that to be done from a structural perspective in order to encourage that stuff down the road. But with MBTA, regardless of sort of where we're doing it, the state doesn't want us to be mandating, and we don't actually mandate it in the 40R either. They use the commercial on the first floor. We're not able to go quite that far to say it must be commercial, which is one reason, back to the conversation that you and I had, was in Story Avenue and Low Street, if Story Avenue and Low Street rezoning is not MBTA, we would be able to say you must keep, you know, on the first floor must be active, you know, uses that are commercial, or, you know, on that end of this tax spectrum, right? Those uses we could maintain, whereas if we go with MBTA, we would not be able to do that. The developer might be able to come in and say, I'm gonna use this particular parcel and I'm only gonna do housing, and you might have housing, you know. So across the spectrum, both 40R and MBTA, it does allow a path for someone to focus more on the housing than say a mix. But it's one reason we're trying to maybe preserve some of the allowance or the control of the mix at, say, Story Avenue and Low Street. I would be a little bit less concerned about it in the context here. I think there's pros and cons to all of it, and I actually prefer to encourage those first floor uses like that. But under MBTA, they don't really want us to. They want us to allow the multifamily as a standalone use by itself.
Yeah, they want all housing.
Yeah.
If they can get it.
They want housing.
They're desperate for housing.
Yeah.
But we gotta keep our commercial tax base intact. So we gotta figure out how to navigate that.
Is this all gonna be done by private contract? Or is the city proposing some sort of eminent domain to?
That hasn't been thrown out at all. No, not at all. So again, if you have any strong feelings one way or the other about whether or not, the district is expanded this way or that way, it doesn't matter what your opinion is. If you had one, let me know, because that way you can kind of keep it in mind, take into account as we sort of navigate the spectrum of, opinions and get to something that ultimately speaking, the council will have to, go up with. I don't think it's particularly hard for Newburyport compared to other places, to comply here. I don't think it's necessarily problematic. We have options available that are logical to me from a land use perspective where to put it. But we have to make a decision at the end of the day where that's going to be.
What does this do to the industrial park? Is this an overlay over part of the industrial park so that the,
As of right now, it would be an overlay that we would do. We could ultimately move or get rid of the underlying industrial, zoning that's there. Thus far, we've just contemplated, just like the 40 hours today, an overlay. So the underlying industrial zoning is still there for some of this western end of the 40-hour district. But the overlay allows the developer to come in and say, I'm gonna do housing.
So this will, if you will, be written by city council with your office in the planning board, and will be voted on to become new law for Newburyport.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, we just, by the end of the calendar year, we have to make the changes necessary to comply with MBTA. And that means, first off, deciding where we want to do additional zoning, because the existing 40R doesn't quite get us there.
Okay.
A lot, but it doesn't quite get us there.
Thanks.
how come it's not going in the other direction instead of over the industrial park?
Down Parker Street.
Like this side?
So, long story, I mean, there's a lot of different parameters, but long story short, there's no benefit for us in using the cemetery. We get no credit. So that's a huge, that's what's down there.
Okay,
Bunch of wetlands, there's a bunch of criteria to
A
apply.
lot of what?
And, so, somebody throwing out, well, rezone the whole Back Bay neighborhood, I mean, there's a lot of different ideas that are thrown out. That's a dicey one, I think. I'm sure Larry can appreciate. I didn't think that was gonna go very far, but, there's ideas across the spectrum, but unfortunately, every time we have a conversation about it, we have to sort of walk through, oh, by the way, this constraint kind of undermines the ability of your appropriateness of doing that one, right? So we have to walk through, and sort of come back to these limited options we have. There are plenty, in my view, to kind of do it responsibly and appropriately. But we have to make a decision at the end of the day, and we have to land somewhere. So we're running through the maps of each lot, essentially what it can provide at the end of the day, compare it against to this rigorous model. We have to run through these algorithms to kind of, the way the state wants the data is spit out. But at the end of the day, we're basically looking for the parcels, the additional parcels necessary to create that housing gap that the 40R district doesn't already provide.
That has to be in place by December 31st.
Correct.
It should have been before the city council 3 years ago.
Well, this wasn't, I mean, first of all,
I mean, it takes them a long time to walk through some of this.
yeah, I mean, that's important.
That's complicated, it is.
I wish it wasn't that complicated, because I actually don't think it needs to be. But there are many different opinions and perspectives about how we approach that. Even the
Yeah.
criteria, there was, discussion, like, here are the criteria we think we should brainstorm, we think we should use for it. And of course, not everybody agrees on exactly what the criteria should be,
Sure.
So, and that's your starting point for evaluating, So, hopefully it's not one of those things that gets bogged down in committee. It is, to me, it shouldn't be something that takes more than a couple of weeks to, make a decision on, but.
So you're spanning two different wards, to two different counselors. You have a group that runs the industrial park owners. And then you have the Back Bay neighborhood, and then you have the State Street neighborhood, and they're all gonna wanna have their say.
Sure, yeah.
That's what makes it complicated.
It's at least 7 months.
There's no place in making a zoning
Yeah,
change, well,
no,
necessarily,
Right, that's right.
I don't necessarily think we need to, and I wouldn't take the Milton approach per se, but at the end of the day, folks may not be happy with the mandate or, happy certain components with it. I'm not happy with the 20% cap myself. But at the end of the day, I think we have to decide just a few more parcels where we're gonna do it and get that, decision made so we can do the rest of the process involved with getting a package to the state to comply, so.
You're gonna make the best of the bad decisions.
The best, so the word,
You're gonna
least,
do that.
works.
yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not everybody's gonna be
Yeah,
happy, so you're
right,
gonna
right.
make the best of
Yeah.
the bad decisions.
Yeah, yeah,
I don't know how to put that, but yes.
Yeah, the lesser of two evils, as they say,
Yeah,
right?
because we moved the original 40R around quite a bit until everybody seemed to settle into something they were happy.
That's kind of what the exercise we're doing right now, yeah, and we just have to keep walking through the parameters and, every time someone throws an idea, well, what about this or that, we have to walk through the pros and cons of that, and I would hope in the next week or two at our next zoning meeting, when we meet on this with a few other updates, we had discussion today with the state about some of the parameters, because their model doesn't fully take into account some of the local requirements, you know, they're going on in zoning, so they have to kind of make up on the fly how they want us to do certain things, and that just makes it more cumbersome, but just, yeah, sort that out, so. Sooner we make the decision, the better it'll be for the process, so. All right,
Okay,
thank you.
well, thank you, Andy, for sharing. I think we're looking for a motion to adjourn.
I so move.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you, have a good night.
Bye-bye.